Hello and welcome to episode 1 of the Cat Who Project, a podcast where we take a deep dive into Lillian Jackson Braun's world of Qwill and Coco. So episode 1 and book 1, and of course we need to start with the man himself, don't we? Mr. Jim Qwilleran, how it begins and where he's at in life. What I did find interesting, considering I didn't read these books in order, was that so much of what we know and love about Qwill is laid out in the first book, on the first page and even in the first sentence. Here's the very first line of the very first book. Jim Qwilleran, whose name has confounded typesetters and proofreaders for 2 decades. I mean, this really introduces the spelling of Qwilleran's name with the QW rather than the usual QU as a solid character in its own right, really. There's a lovely line a little further on where Arch Riker teases Qwill about the spelling. He says, "Do you still spell your name with that ridiculous W?" Just on the topic of Qwill's name, I thought it was really interesting that Arch addresses Qwill as Jim, not only when they meet again, but Arch also introduces Qwill as Jim to the men in the press club. I'll be interested to see when Arch actually starts calling Jim Qwill. But maybe he always calls him Jim, I'm not sure now. On the first page, we also discover that Qwill has been a newspaperman for more than 20 years. He's waiting for an interview at the Daily Fluxion. He's scanning the late edition and he spots a couple of typos, of course. But I think the coolest thing about the first page is a cheeky reference to cats. There's an article about a kitten that's stuck down a drain pipe and Qwill bypasses it. He doesn't even read it, which I think is really funny. We learn in the first chapter of this book that Qwill has had quite an extensive career as a sports writer, a police reporter, and a war correspondent. He's also the author of a book on urban crime and he's even been a winner of the Publisher's Trophy, so he's quite well known in the newspaper world. Yet here he is applying for a job at the Daily Flux that seems well below his skill level. And the editor seems even apologetic when he says that all he can offer him is a desk in the features department, which seems to be a bit of a come down for Qwill and definitely outside his scope of skills and interests. I think what's really interesting about this first book is that we are meeting Qwill at a really low part of his life. There's a real sense of loneliness, and there seems to be a bit of a backstory. Qwill refers to a succession of short-term jobs on smaller and smaller newspapers, followed by a long period of unemployment or no jobs worth listing. What happened? Qwill alludes to a situation saying that he wore out his welcome in several cities, and later in the book he refers to his recent reputation. So it seems that he has been moving a lot. There's no mention of a family, only that he is no longer married. This snippet of personal information is discovered when he meets up with Arch Riker in the first chapter. Arch is the feature editor at the Daily Flux, and we know from letter books that Qwill and Arch were boyhood friends. They were really close. But when they meet on Qwill's first day at the Daily Flux, Arch doesn't seem to know that Qwill was no longer married, so it would seem that the 2 childhood friends had lost contact. But although Arch wasn't aware of Qwill's personal situation, he does know about Qwill's recent sketchy past and reputation. But the banter between the 2 old friends is quite funny and establishes an obvious, comfortable and long-lasting connection between the men. So Qwill seems to be starting over in a new city, at a new job with no family, and he doesn't even have a permanent place to stay. He's currently staying at what he describes as the Plastic Palace. It's an old, inexpensive hotel where everything is covered in plastic. The floors, the armchairs, and the breakfast is served cold on plastic plates. Qwill's discomfort continues when he meets the young editor of the Flux for the first time. He's young and sprightly, and Qwill describes him as the new generation of editor. The young editor, who is not named, offers Qwill the art beat. Qwill is horrified and winces internally, composing the headline, "Vet Newsman Put Out to Pasture." He knows nothing about the art beat and says as much, but the young editor assures him that this will give them a fresher viewpoint. But there are some familiarities that lift Qwill and give him comfort, and one of those is the press club. Early in the first chapter, there's a passage that reads, "Once upon a time, the press clubs had been his life, his love, his hobby, his home, his inspiration." The Flux Press Club is described as dim and noisy, and I love this passage. Conversation was high-key with confidential undertones. Qwill knew that this meant that there were rumours circulating, campaigns being launched, and cases being solved unofficially over a beer and a hamburger. It's here that we see what Qwill orders as his regular drink. We know that he no longer drinks alcohol, and in Pickaxe, his drink of choice is skunk water. But in Book 1, in the Daily Flux Press Club, Qwill asks for a double tomato juice on the rocks. The bartender replies, "Tom on the rocks? You want to squeeze a lime and a shot of Worcestershire?" Qwill says no. "How about a shot of Tabasco to give it a bite?" To which Qwill answers, "No, just pour it straight." He is frequently teased for this throughout the book, and there is one low moment where Qwill asks for a double scotch and almost drinks it, but thankfully is distracted by a phone call. Comfort also comes to Qwill later in the book through another main character, Montclements. Montclements invites Qwill to move into the spare apartment downstairs, and there seems to be a real sense of relief when he moves into the art critic's spare apartment. It's comfortable, it's warm, and of course, there's Coco. The sense of loneliness that was quite prominent at the beginning of the book seems to ease as the story progresses. In particular, it's really lovely to see Qwill gain a sense of companionship with Coco, and in some cases, he even chooses the company of Coco over his mates at the press club. Of course, one of the most significant things to happen in this first book is that Coco and Qwill meet. We'll talk more about Coco in an upcoming episode, but I think the loveliest thing about their relationship is that Coco absolutely eases Qwill's loneliness. He becomes a companion, but even more than that, Qwill is mesmerised by Coco and admires his regal qualities. But as time goes on, he really becomes a cat dad. He worries about him, and he frequently puts Coco's needs before his own. There's a couple of lovely moments in the book that show this growing bond between Qwill and Coco. This passage. Coco looked up with a beseeching expression in his blue eyes, purred loudly, and raised one paw to Qwill's knee. "Coco, I'll bet you're lonesome. You're used to having someone around all day. Are you feeling neglected?" He lifted the willing bundle of warm fur to his shoulder, and Coco purred in his ear with a rasping undertone that denoted extreme satisfaction. "I think I'll stay home tonight," Qwill told the cat. "Weather's bad, snow's getting deep. Left my rubbers at the office." There's another passage towards the end of the book that is really lovely, and one in which Qwill chooses Coco over the press club. It reads, "Afterwards, his urge to go back to the press club for dinner was less powerful than his urge to go home and see Coco. The cat, he told himself, was now an orphan. Siamese were particularly needful of companionship. The bereaved animal had been locked up alone in Qwill's apartment all day." Of course, Polly is not in the first few books, as Qwill is still living down below. Polly is quite a controversial character in the cat who community, with many people not liking her too much. But one of the main things that Qwill finds attractive about Polly is her voice. I'm currently listening to The Cat Who Knew Shakespeare, and there's a line that says, "Polly was not as young and slender as a career woman, he had dated down below, but she was an interesting woman with a voice that sometimes made his head spin. In this first book, we are introduced to this trait of Qwill's when he first hears Zoe Lambrecht's voice at the Valentine's ball. He hears a woman's voice, soft and low. She said, "Aren't you the new man for the Daily Fluxion?" His moustache tingled. Women's voices sometimes affected him that way, and this voice was like caressing fingers. There's so many more lovely little details about Qwill's character, like that he's always loved sailboats. But I think my favourite quirk of Qwill's is that he hates the top row of a typewriter. QWERTYUIOP, because it means he's stymied, that he should be writing brilliant copy, and that he hasn't an idea in his head. So at the beginning of Book 1, Qwill is at the start of a new chapter in his life. But as the story continues, he really seems to settle into his new city, new lodgings, new press club, and new beat. He re-establishes his comfortable friendship with Arch. He solves a crime on the art beat, and he finds a new admiration and love for a cat called Coco. Of course, there is so much more to Qwill's character, including his moustache and his love of food, but we will explore more of those in an upcoming episode of the Cat Who Project. Well, that's it for this week, Cat Who friends. I hope you enjoyed this episode of the Cat Who Project. My name is Rowan, and we shall talk again soon. Thank you so much for listening.